His touch was sweet and forbidden. He wasn't human. The line hung in the air like a promise and a warning, as small and bright and impossible as a bead of honey balanced on the tongue. It belonged to the night more than to any mouth. A memory of warmth where warmth had no right to be, a trace that settled under the skin and refused to leave. They had been laughing when it happened. 5 shadows folded into a rusted sedan, the country road unspooling beneath tired headlights. Glass had tipped. Voices had shrunk to slurred conversations. Jordan rode with pride like someone wearing a well-loved jacket. The road belonged to him that way then. Kelvin joked too loudly about his girlfriend. Marcus mouthed a crude line and earned a shove. Samuel tried to talk sense into everyone and failed. David hummed under his breath until silence came over him like a hand over a candle. They were careless, young in the exact way that lives later judge and find wanting. They called a stop at the bend by the old church because someone wanted to piss, because they were invincible, and because the night was steady with rain that smelled like iron. Jordan got out, the hem of his jeans cold against the wet grass. He didn't see the hood until it spread, a sudden fan of warning half hidden in the weeds, a cobra, black and gleaming in the soaked light, like a shard of midnight come alive. The laugh died in Jordan's throat. Someone whistled. Marcus, always eager for a show, mimicked the whistle, and the cobra rose and tasted the night air with a tongue like a thin blade. Then the bottle and the bravado and the stupid, contagious courage. They surrounded it with shoes and fists and the sharp red stripe of alley light. One of them swung a boot, and the snake struck toward leather and flesh and fear, and was met instead by a boot and a scream and a long, thankful silence. They beat it until its body lay uncoiled and still like a fallen question. They patted each other, clapped shoulders, claimed the world back for themselves. They missed one thing, a thin shape that slid into the car with Jordan, unnoticed, coiling between leather and the warm press of bodies. A creature that fit where none should, and carried the taste of the earth in its scales. By dawn the grass had a map of their wrongness. Flattened places where laughter had been slept off. A smear of vomit near the ditch. In the headlights the dead snake looked smaller, ridiculous. Jordan rinsed his hands at a pump and cracked jokes that stopped when the pump made a thin, hungry sound. He told himself the world had been repaired by force. The cobra had been only a snake, only a hazard to a thoughtless night. He did not see the way the car hummed under his touch, as if something in the leather breathed at the same rhythm as his heart. He did not feel the brush, the almost imperceptible slide of a tongue against him, the weight that settled where someone else's warmth might have. That would come later, and not as explanation, but as a punctuation. A memory that arrived without cause and seated itself behind the ribs. Morning offered no guilt. Kelvin was the first to call, voice flat and jarring. He said he'd been tired, fell into sleep and not wake for a long while. He laughed and then didn't answer. Jordan heard the laughter again when he arrived at Kelvin's apartment. A figure in repose, mouth slack, chest not rising with panic, but with an absence so complete it was the same as a photograph. He touched Kelvin's wrist on reflex, and felt the double dots there. 2 dark pinpricks, like the smallest of constellations mapped into skin. They were identical, precise, placed side by side as if by a careful hand. Jordan thought of the cobra. He thought of the way the night had been handed over to him and his friends. He thought of the way he had kicked at something that rose to defend the world, and how he had laughed afterwards. Guilt is a soft pressure before it hardens. He drove until the road blurred. Then she appeared. She was on the lane that led to his compound, as if she'd always belonged there. A silhouette at the edge of the trees, a dress that looked spun from white light and rain. She was beautiful, in the way that hurts your eyes. Too symmetrical, a curl of hair that caught light and became silver. Eyes that were dark and calm like a pool. Jordan's first motion was to warn himself, "Don't stop. Keep driving." The car's engine mumbled and then he found himself slamming the brake at the sight of her. Because beauty at dawn seems like a question from the gods, she met his sudden stare without alarm. Up close, there was nothing grotesque in her human shape, nothing theatrical. But the feel of her presence was wrong in a way that made him breathe smaller. She smelled like wet earth and jasmine, like things that belong to the ground, mixed with something older and sweeter. When she stepped to the window, her hand brushed the glass, and the smear it left gleamed like oil. Jordan wanted to tell himself not to pick up strangers. Instead, he opened the door. She said her name was Diana. Her voice was low and precise, like a tongue that had learned to speak slowly on purpose. She spoke as if choosing every word, as if every sound might matter more than inanimate life allows. She accepted, without questions, his offer to shelter her from the first rain. He told himself he took pity, because he was alone in a house made of too many memories. Pity moved toward her like an abandoned dog. Her body fit his furniture as neatly as if she had always been measured against it. She poured tea with a practiced grace, thumb against porcelain, steam like a veil between them. She laughed, and the laugh lived a fraction of a second too late to be merely human. At night, she slept like a person. In the morning she woke with a hunger in her eyes that Jordan felt as if a reach had been made into the back of his throat. She was at once a balm and a blade. When she rested her hand on his knee, the touch was quicksilver warm, an ache of comfort, and a hiss beneath the skin. He tasted sweetness at the edges of himself, as if someone had fed him honey without his consent. Later, when he brushed his wrist, there would be a memory in his flesh, a prickle like a fine wire under the skin, and he would find two tiny dark dots sleeping where her fingers had rested. He told himself they were from a stray insect. He told himself many things because telling is a thin and noble defense. In the week after Diana arrived, things that had been steady eroded along the edges. Samuel left a note in his apartment, ordinary in tone. "Sorry, I'm tired, couldn't sleep here." Jordan drove by Samuel's place and found him folded against his couch in a pose of too clean surrender. The double marks sat on Samuel's neck, a pair of silent commas. Marcus didn't arrive for a shift he swore he would work. At dawn, his roommate found him lifeless in the shower with water still on his hair and the two marks like deliberate punctuation at the base of his throat. David was last. He turned away in the night and never turned back. Each death shared the same soft cruelty. No struggle, no crying, just a slipping into a sleep deep enough to be final. The faces were gentle, as if soothed before they paused. With each friend lost, Jordan's shoulders shrank inward. He learned to live in the spaces between breaths. He found the shard in his bed on a morning when he supposed he might not wake. A sliver of something not quite skin, iridescent and fragile, like a fingernail fallen from an animal that had dressed itself in moonlight. It lay hidden among the sheets, catching the light and shivering. He should have called the police, should have circled the map and underlined the names, should have seen the thread go back to the night by the ditch. He did call authorities eventually, but the word they used when a person died in sleep was unexplained, and that felt like a thin coat to keep out the weather. He called Kelvin's family and had to answer questions that felt like knives. Were there any signs of a struggle? Did he have health conditions? Did anyone want to cause him harm? On the other end of the line there were hands that clenched and didn't unclench, and Diana moved closer as if drawn by gravity. She sat in the armchair like a tenant of everything and nothing. She asked Jordan his favorite color, and then watched him tell her with the patient interest of someone cataloging birds. When he woke in the dark, she was there in the doorway, pale as the inside of a shell, and he would let his hand find her as if by muscle memory. The touch was small and potent, a warmth like a pressed coin, and then a faint chill threading out from the contact. His heart would stutter as if learning a new language. She spoke rarely of her past. She said the word home sometimes, and looked toward the tree line beyond his porch as if listening to a voice there. She adored old music and knew the names of plants he had only half heard in his childhood. Occasionally she would press her palm to the floor and close her eyes with a look of prayer or of calculation. Sometimes they seemed to be the same thing for her. Her affection was complicated. She saved him from panic on nights when his guilt roared like an engine with no spark. She made soup and hummed while he ate. When he vomited once from the combination of grief and rum, she held his hair without tenderness and smeared cool cloths over his forehead with the efficiency of someone accustomed to attending to wounds. He thought that was love. He thought of it as a kind of mercy. It is the nature of mercy to be suspect in a time shaped by retribution. Jordan's waking life narrowed to small rituals, checking his phone for messages, staring at the ashtray until the cigarette had burned a signature on its edge, waking to find Diana close, yet not touching. He grew skilled at sensing her near without looking. The quiet rustle of fabric like a serpent's scales, the scent of rain on a roof. When he found the shard in his sheets, something in him recognized a truth he'd been blundering around. They had not simply killed a snake. They had severed an entire lineage of watchfulness, and, perhaps, gratitude. One night, when the moon was a white coin pinned to gauze of cloud, Diana rose before him and went out into the yard. The air outside his small compound had the feel of a throat clearing. Something was coming. Jordan followed on bare feet because he could not accept the thought of morning without an answer. Diana stood at the edge of the property where the trees gather and leaned her forehead to the bark of an old gum tree. She made a sound that was not a language he knew, a chittering that rose like a question into the dark. He watched her, and he saw it then. In the low light, when she turned slightly, the line of her jaw caught like a blade. There was a slowness in her that was not human indecision. It was a measuring, as if she were weighing the life of something small and the life of something else. She looked at him, and her eyes were full of a tenderness that put him to shame. He wanted to step forward and cradle her face with the hands that had always tried to fix things with force. He wanted to repair. Instead, she took his hand. The touch arrived like a small violation and a gift at once. Honey spread across a cold morning. Immediate comfort followed by the prick of a hidden wire. He felt something crawl like small fire along his wrist, and then cease. He laughed, a sound that broke into nothing, because even joy felt like a borrowed coat. When he looked, her fingers had left 2 twin dots on his skin, so faint they might have been freckles if the light had favored them. They were precise, like a stamp gone through flesh. "You should be careful," she said, as if warning him to keep his wallet close. "Night takes what is left in the open." He wanted to ask how she knew his name at heart, why her words felt scripted to fit the hollow inside him. Instead, he wrapped his fingers around hers and realized he no longer wanted to be empty. Her fingers were cool, and he liked that cool, as if his chest were a desert after rain. The pattern of deaths continued. Each one came on the edge of sleep, a velvet collapse. Each victim bore the twin marks Jordan now recognized as a signature. He stopped calling the friends who had not yet died. He pretended to be busy. He pretended to be above the weather of grief, because pretending is a small, accessible god. At the funeral for Marcus, Jordan sat with Diana in a row that smelled of lilies and notes of perfumed grief. She wore black and did not seem to fade into it. Her features were composed, the face of someone who could make herself a stepping stone and still look surprised when others used it. After everyone else had left a single bouquet on the grass, she took Jordan's wrist and pressed her thumb over the twin dots like a mother checking the pulse of a child. He felt nothing except the burn of a heat that had no right there. "What will they ask you?" Jordan asked her quietly, as if fearing that a louder question would break the ground beneath him. "They will ask what they can name," she said, choosing words the way a surgeon chooses instruments. "Names help when the world is trying to forget a debt. But names are not always the truth." The truth, Jordan had learned, was a stranger you could not bargain with. Late that night, she led him to her bedroom. Small, lit by the light of a single lamp that made the room look like a memory. She moved as though on strings, delicate and precise. They lay together, aligned in a geometry that felt chosen, and their breaths kept time. Between them the air was a current of something that could be called intimacy, if one were willing to let that word map onto a more complicated shape. He felt again that forbidden sweetness, the small thrill and the threat that lay beneath it. He tasted honey that was not his. In private, away from the damp familiarity of his friends' deaths and the forensic procedure of grief, Diana's voice changed. It lost its careful edges and became a softer instrument. "Do you ever dream of the place you were before?" he asked her once, dangerous and needy. She turned her face to him, and for a long moment, there was only the sound of their slow breathing. "My dream is not of a before," she said, and the language around the words shifted. "I dream of debt." She had someone else, though. A presence that lived in the crook of her shoulder like a shadow at noon. Jordan learned of the mother in pieces, a story told in whispers, a name that moved over Diana like a winter wind. Twice Jordan found his guest kneeling on the floor with her forehead to the ground, crystalline shards spread around her like offerings. Once he had left and returned to the room to find dirt swept in a perfect circle at Diana's feet, and a faint trace of scales glinting in the lamplight. A mother, apparently, who kept the ledger of things taken and returned. The mother was older than the night and colder than the clay floor. She came one afternoon, stepping from the trees like a thought made visible. Her hair was the color of old wheat and fell in thick ropes down her back. Her eyes were the yellow-brown of river water in drought. She wore no dress as a human would, her garments wrapped around her in the way a cloak decides what it will be. She spoke to Diana in a language that made Jordan's skin tighten. When she turned to him, she did not smile. "You taught them nothing," the mother said, and her voice was soft like a blade resting on silk. "Men will break promises they do not know they have made. They must be taught the cost." Diana lowered her eyes. Jordan stood and felt like a child called by its own name. "Justice," the mother said. "That is what we owe. The land keeps balance." Jordan thought of the beating, the animal writhing in the grass, the shape of the cobra's head when they had finally stopped. He thought of the line between thoughtless cruelty and fate. He wondered whether justice was something that could be given, or whether it was a thing that took, and would never be satisfied. The mother did not linger to embrace her daughter like a human matron would. She moved as if rehearsed in the choreography of authority. She placed her hand on Diana's shoulder, and something like a hush passed between them that vibrated into the air and called the leaves still. That touch was not warm. It was like frozen river water ran over the back of Jordan's neck in recollection. Diana flinched perceptibly, but made no sound. 3 days, the mother said then, and the words fell into the room with the impact of a bell. 3 days to finish what must be finished, or the debt will be carried in other ways. You know what happens when debts pile higher than the riverbank. Jordan felt his own throat close. The phrase 3 days had the inevitability of a calendar with a black hand ticking the hours. Diana's face was pale. She looked like someone who had lost a negotiation and was trying to determine whether she could steal back the terms. "Why him?" Diana asked quietly. And the question was both a plea and a rebuke. For the first time he saw something in her that was human and not a costume. Shame. She watched his face as if calculating the exact amount of mercy she could offer without losing herself. There was a pain in her that was not the pain of a monster but the sorrow of someone condemned to choose between two harms. "Because he was there," the mother said. "Because men broke a covenant and left the ledger unbalanced. Because the world remembers what was taken." The ultimatum hung in the air as if already counted out. 3 days to complete a requirement stamped in a tongue Jordan had never learned. He thought of his friends lying like statues broken by sleep, of the tiny twin marks like stitches in the air. He imagined a ledger with his name in a column and a balance that he couldn't read. The mother turned away then, as if the task completed its step in the presence of a witness. Diana stayed. She touched Jordan's wrist and left for him, with a gentleness that made his bones ache. The same pattern of small, precise dots. He began to see them everywhere. A scar on an old neighbor's arm, the faded birthmarks on the inside of a child's wrist. Like the world kept offering the same punctuation and asking to be read. The deadline sat on Jordan's chest like a stone he could not cough up. He could not believe she would kill him. He could not think she would not. He had been light as a moth flitting near a lantern, and now the flame had anchored itself and would not be put out. He slept badly, waking to see Diana's shape in the doorway like a question with fingers. He sought counsel from the one place people go when they seek words that are soft enough to live in the cold. The church. It was a small place with flaking paint and a pastor whose hands were the color of toasted bread. The pastor's office smelled like paper and old coffee. Jordan told him pieces of the story and left other pieces like offerings at the altar because the words are not always useful in full. The pastor did not say the words people wanted. He did not call for rites or for a line of salt around the house. He listened, and that was in its own way an absolution. "Not all danger announces itself with horns," the pastor said finally, "and not all justice is what we imagine. Be cautious," he added, his voice not ungentle but pragmatic. "Not everything that gives comfort is a friend. Hospitality is a good thing. It is not an unending shield." Jordan left with a head full of good intentions and a body that could not be tricked into feeling safe. Outside the church the rain had started again. like a soft applause for a world that makes rules and then fails to keep them. He walked back toward the house with the pastor's last phrase lingering in his ears. Not all danger announces itself with horns. Diana watched him come in like someone peering through panes of glass. She folded her hands loosely in her lap and said nothing when he crossed the threshold. He wanted to confess everything: the shard, the deaths, the twin dots, the ultimatum. The admission stuck in his throat like a bird. In the silence between them there was movement. The subtle creak of his chair. The house settling. A soft hiss that might have been the wind through the eaves. Diana reached out then, and Jordan's chest prepared itself as if for impact. Her hand came to his face this time, light as moth wings, and lingered at his jaw. The touch was familiar and foreign. It warmed and cooled at the same time, like someone had traced both flame and ice along the same line. He closed his eyes as if that might make the sensation more ordinary. The sensation was not ordinary. It tasted like the memory of childhood sweets, like the aftertaste of honey and something iron beneath it. It left a quiet that was a promise and a threat in the same breath. She bent and kissed the corner of his mouth, a movement more reverent than possessive. And he felt her breath on his skin like a petal falling. He could have said the world had never been kinder. He could have sworn that somewhere under these small mercies lay redemption. Instead, when he turned his palm, 2 dots had been placed there, as symmetrical and meaningless as the punctuation on a page. They were darker than the skin, blunt as a mark made by someone who had used a steady instrument. Jordan pressed his finger to them and felt a small heat like a spark. "What are those?" he asked. She watched him, and her look held a sorrow so deep that he felt his own grief as if borrowed. "Marks," she said. "Signs of remembering. They tell a story." Her voice did not harden as much as narrow. She could not be quite unwound from duty. "Will you—" He stopped because there was no word for ask, no word for beg that would make sense. "Will you let me go?" Her fingers tightened minutely, a touch that was almost a smile. "I will do what I can," she said. "But you must know, I am not only my own hands. There is a ledger." He thought of the mother shaping cold pronouncements as if he had been an accusation under her tongue. He thought of the 3 days and of the way the world sometimes balances itself by making those who have taken something return it or else pay a price. He imagined the mother's ledger like an ocean turning the tide. The night before the deadline, Diana sat before the old gum tree and whispered the language she used when she was alone. Jordan stayed inside and listened to the sound of leaves and the house complaining. He watched her shadow move on the lawn, a figure bent like a question. The moon was a thin coin overhead, and within its light Diana looked younger and older at once. At dawn, Jordan woke with the taste of the word forgiveness on his tongue, an unfamiliar word that seemed to mean nothing without an altar. He dressed quickly and walked outside and found Diana by the porch, hair loose, eyes open to the sky. She took his hand as she had 1,000 times with a tenderness that made his chest unsteady. The small pattern of twin marks was visible again at the base of his palm. The dots like a gamekeeper's final tally. 3 days, he said softly, as if through repetition a barrier might be worn down. 3 days, she echoed, and the line between her need and duty tightened like a seam. The river will ask. I will be called to answer. He had to ask the question that had lodged under his ribs and would not be dislodged. If you don't, if you choose me over them, what happens? She swallowed. Her mouth curved in a way that almost made the smile turn into a lamplight warmth. Then the edges pulled back into something harder to name. I do not know, she said. Not all debts are tallied in ways our tongues can read. Some are carried and returned in forms we fear. But there are other costs besides the ones visible. The mother had not lied when she used the language of ledger. She had merely chosen a metaphor small enough for human hands. The implication gnawed at Jordan. Refusal might mean reprisal of a kind that would break more than the guilty. It might mean Diana herself would be taken by laws older than human pity. He looked at her then and saw the distance in her face. The part of her that measured the world like a balance, and the part that contained him like a fragile object. Stay with me tonight, he said. The plea was simplest in its stupidity, and therefore perhaps the most honest thing he had said in days. She did. They lay awake and held one another as if holding time would be enough. Outside, the world moved along its slow axis. The small town had its own oblivious rituals, a shopkeeper wheeling his doors open, the clattering of a truck on a far road, the soft amble of a dog with no purpose. Inside the house, the two of them breathed each other like a poem. When midnight slipped close, her phone, she had one, though she rarely used it, buzzed with a message that was not for her. The words were an instruction. The language of the sender was not human in cadence, though it was typed in letters anyone could read. Jordan could not make out the symbols at first, but then he saw a single phrase repeated like a drumbeat. Finish what is owed. Diana read it and folded the phone back into her palm, the way a person might fold up a map no longer needed. There was a strain in her face like something heavy being borne. She leaned forward and kissed Jordan on the forehead, and the kiss was both blessing and condemnation. Outside the house the gum trees whispered, and the wind wanted to know who was sleeping and who was awake. The world did not wait on human mercy. It had its own ledger. At the small hours, Jordan woke from a dream in which he'd been a boy again, running barefoot through the fields, and then stumbling into a hole that opened and swallowed his friends one by one, their faces blurry in the dimness. He jolted upright and found Diana at the foot of the bed. She looked worn like a traveler who had crossed an ocean and found the shore colder than imagined. "Tonight," she said. Her voice was thin and contains a tremor. "Tonight I will go." Jordan tried to stand, but the bed was a weight in his limbs. "Then come back," he said. Words are fragile in the face of the inevitable. "I am not sure I will be allowed," she whispered. "The ledger wants balance, and I must answer it." She touched his cheek. The contact was more intimate than any other they had shared. It carried the accumulated tenderness of weeks and the danger of an ocean's undertow. Jordan felt the sweetness of the touch bloom like a sudden sugar on his tongue, and then, like a shadow under sugar, a cold tighter than breath. He wanted to ask what she intended to do, to beg her to choose a path that might break the chain. He had no plans that could hold against a tradition older than the trees. He found himself murmuring a question that was perhaps less brave than it felt. "Will you kill me?" Her eyes slipped to his, and then away. She closed them as if in prayer. "I do not want to," she said. "But there are things that demand payment in ways I cannot ever be certain of. It is not only about killing you, Jordan. It is about what it costs me to refuse." The dawn came on like a rumor and then a fact. The rain had started a new, thin, steady rain that rhymed everything in a cold silver. The world outside was washed clean, and for a moment the ghastly ledger could not be seen. Within the house, the threads of fate tightened. He dressed, hands slow, and thought of the pastor's office, of the pastor's words. Not all danger announces itself with horns. He thought of Kelvin with his pale face, and the twin dots that had first taught him to measure the world differently. He thought of his friends as they had been in the car that night, their laughter like a canopy. He imagined the whip of the bottle and the sudden gravity of a boot on living scale. He thought of how carelessness had the momentum of a train. Diana led him to the edge of the property. The mother waited beneath the gum tree like an accusation carved in bone. There were other figures there as well, not many and not needful of numbers, silhouettes that belonged more to the trees than to human measure. They did not greet Jordan. Instead, they watched with the cool patience of those who measure things for a long time and have become inured to pleading. The mother stepped forward and placed her hands on Diana's shoulders. She spoke to her daughter in a cadence that made Diana's posture buckle just the tiniest fraction, as if a wind had pressed against a fragile house. "It must be done," the mother said. "It is the law." Diana's response was a thin thread of sound swallowed by the trees. Jordan felt a displacement in the world, a place where rules had been quietly different all along, and he had never bothered to look. "You have one last chance," the mother said, and the words were neither mercy nor cruelty. They carried the certainty of accounting. "Choose." Diana turned to Jordan then, and in her eyes there was an entire landscape of contradiction. Sorrow like a river, a stubborn gentleness, a spring of something fierce and yet tender. She placed both hands on his face, palms cupped like a person making a vow. "If I do not pull this from you," she said, "then it will be taken in other ways. I cannot promise you safety. I can only promise you the truth. My hand will be the cause if it must be done. He swallowed. There was a small, ridiculous hope lodged like a stone. That words could be enough. That explanation might buy mercy. That confession might alter the ledger. He peered. He peered and found himself looking at the ledger of her face. A map of decisions, of debts counted in the thin lines around her eyes. Words failed him, so he let his gaze be a question. She answered not with speech, but with a small movement, as if testing the weight of his soul between her palms. "You could leave," he said, voice scraped like an old hinge. "I will go. Take me away from here. Take me where you are from, anywhere but here." Her hands trembled minutely. For an instant the world narrowed to the small circle of those palms, and Jordan thought he could feel the quiet beating of a heart inside that warmth. The mother watched, her expression carved to moderation. The others kept still. They had no interest in mercy or rumor, only in the settling of accounts. "It is not that simple," Diana murmured. "Leaving is not a ticket that erases what has been taken. The ledger is not a map you fold and put away. It is a work that must be balanced by weight." Jordan thought of Kelvin's blank face, of Marcus standing under the shower and then not standing at all. He tried to name the shape of his guilt, but the name slipped like a fish. "Then take me," he said again, smaller. "Let me be. Let me pay. If the ledger demands it, let it be me." The mother inclined her head. For a being older than breath, she had the patience of a tide that waits for an inlet to declare itself. "You offer yourself," she said, and there was no surprise in it, only the cold observation of a thing finally made to be. That is one kind of payment. But there are rules to how debts move. They cannot be carried by the living in ways that undo the ledger's balance. You will not simply be taken as some coin dropped into a jar. Diana's fingers tightened on Jordan's face. "I could make the change here," she whispered. And in the way she said it, the implication was both dangerous and soft. "I could move the debt onto you. But to do that is to make you like us in a way you cannot foresee. You might keep your life or lose everything you know. The mother would not be pleased, but it might spare others." Jordan thought of a life where his touch became the thing that eased people into sleep. He thought of nights sleeping with the echo of his friends' last breaths in his ears. He imagined walking out among people, shaking hands and leaving twin dots behind without seeing them, like a plague made of small, neat punctuation. It was hideous, and perhaps the only thing he could offer freely. "Do it," he said before he had finished weighing the cost. The words were reckless and true. Diana closed her eyes. For a moment the tree leaves stitched a slow, indifferent pattern above them, and you could have believed that the world might tilt to a different alignment. The mother's mouth moved in a line that could have been a prayer or a curse. There was silence like a held breath. Then Diana rose, moving with deliberate fineness, and took from a pocket the shard Jordan had found weeks before. The iridescent sliver that had lived like a memory between his sheets. It caught the moonlight and threw it back in tiny, impossible colors. "You know what this is," she said, though she did not sound triumphant. Her fingers brushed the shard and it hummed, not with sound so much as with a pressure against the inside of the skull, like something aware it had been recognized. Jordan's chest hollowed. He wanted to snatch the shard away, throw it to the dirt, and step on it until its gloss was gone. He thought of calling the pastor, of asking for any word that might unbind algebra of the heart. But the pastor's office had only offered caution, not a formula for undoing a binding older than sermons. Diana held his hands then, 2 human hands in hers, and the twin marks at the base of his palm seemed to flare. The dots were small and black, and as if stamped by a needle. They pulsed once, twice, like a footfall. Her thumb traced their edges, a gesture that was less about reassurance than about measuring something that would not be measured by numbers. "You said you would do what you could," Jordan whispered. "Do it." She pressed the shard lightly against his skin. It was a touch that should not have hurt, and yet left a cold that traveled inward like a thread pulling on a seam. The house dogs 3 streets over raised their heads and then did not bark. The mother watched as if she had been waiting for that exact minute to be claimed. For a long second nothing happened that Jordan could put into words. He had expected pain or a light that would split the night. Instead, there was the precise sensation he'd felt each time Diana had touched him since the beginning. a sweetness, like a memory of honey melting on the teeth. And beneath it, a thinning chill that spoke of something removed. It felt intimate and impossible at the same time, as if a hand had smoothed out his old shape and tempted him with a new one. When Diana drew the shard away, she did not look triumphant. Her face had gone small with effort, like someone who had run into wind and kept running rather than colliding. Jordan flexed his fingers and found the dots had shifted, as if they had been nudged into a new arrangement. They were still there, those twin marks that had been a signature on others, but now their edges looked slightly luminous, like the hint of scale beneath skin. "You've given me a choice," Diana said, voice raw. "You chose to bear it." The mother's eyes narrowed, not in anger at Jordan, but at Diana. "You have altered the agreement," she said, and the words carried a weight like a stone on an old ledger. "You have made a transfer unauthorized by lineage. That will have consequences." Diana trembled. For the first time, Jordan saw in her not only the stoic measurement of duty, but the cost that such duty demanded, the small unraveling of something that had been tightly woven for generations. "I could not kill him," she said, and the confession was a thing that made her entire face seem to shrink. "I would not kill him." All at once the trees breathed in as if the world were taking a long, shocked inhale. The other figures shifted. One of them, older than the rest and smaller, made a sound that might have been sympathy and might have been a demand. "It is done," the mother said at last, but her voice no longer carried the same smooth closure. "Yet the ledger must be balanced. Transfers alter the shape of many things. Because you moved the debt without permission, there will be a new accounting." Jordan felt the syllables like a chill wind crossing a plain whose fence posts had been uprooted. "What will happen?" he asked, though he suspected the answer could not be clean. The mother looked past him, out into the tree line, as if counting the number of unseen things that would now be required. "Some debts can be carried within a single life," she said slowly. "Some require that what was taken be returned in form. Some call for service. You have made a risky offering, child. You have given your flesh to keep others. The law that governs us does not take greed lightly. It will answer in measure. It may call for what you did not give." Diana's shoulders made a sound like something folding in on itself. She reached for Jordan again and held him tight. He smelled rain and jasmine and something like iron. Around them a quietness settled that had in it a threatened sort of peace, the kind that precedes either relief or ruin. One could never be sure which. "Do you regret it?" Jordan asked, "because confessions are sometimes the only things that can be traded for new truths." Diana's breath hitched. "I regret that I cannot bear your burdens without changing you," she whispered. "I regret that there is no clean mercy. I regret that love is not a currency accepted by old ledgers." He wanted to shelter her, to press his own body between mother and daughter like an errant shield. He wanted to say that he would accept anything because he had once accepted the careless violence that had started all of this. He had given himself guttering chances to be brave, and always taken the appearance of it instead of the essence. Now, offered an actual opportunity to pay, he had done something rash and holy, and perhaps foolish. The mother shifted her weight. "We will take our leave of you now," she said, and the words could have been an end or a beginning. "You will have what you asked for, but do not think that this absolves the world of consequence. There are balances to be struck that humans do not always understand. The ledger is old." They moved like shadows back into the trees. As they vanished, Diana sank onto the porch step and covered her face with both hands. Jordan sat beside her and let the rain soak them both. It felt like absolution and like exposure. In the days that followed, life did not resume its old rhythms. The town carried on. Shop doors opened, buses hissed at curbs, but Jordan's world had narrowed to the circumference of his own skin. The twin dots had been altered. They were still small and precise, but now when his skin brushed another's, his fingers left a faint remembering, a warmth that tasted sweet in memory, and a cold thread that hummed under the flesh. He found that sometimes when he reached to steady someone on a wet step or to hand over a kettle, that person smiled and did not notice the faint aftertaste on their mind, and then later they would wake and be still. He learned quickly what the mother had hinted at. The ledger did not only demand death, it had many ways of taking account. There were nights when the town dreamed sweetly, and woke to notice that an old debt had been settled, an unpaid favor returned, a lost trinket found. But such returns came at odd costs. The grieving families of his friends watched Jordan with a suspicion that was almost reverent. He was forgiven and yet set apart by something they could not name. Diana watched him with a sorrow that was now lined with an inscrutable serenity. She had not been stripped of her role. She remained one of the river of her kind, tethered by things Jordan could not unlearn. But there was a gentleness to her that had been carved out by what she had refused to do. She had risked the anger of a law older than mercy. She had not destroyed him. She had changed the shape of what would be counted, but the mother had said consequences would come. Jordan began to notice other things. Mirrors sometimes bent his reflection at the edge, not enough to warp, but enough to make him involuntarily check himself. On certain nights, when the moon hung thin and the air smelled of dust and rain, a soft hiss would enter a room, and someone else would breathe easier and sleep deeper. The marks on his skin sometimes glimmered faintly when he was near water, like scales beneath transparency. He became more cautious, not because he feared being taken by a law of debt, but because he did not want the world to be reshaped by what his hands would leave behind. He avoided touching strangers. He slept with gloves on some nights, ridiculous gestures that made his palms itch with shame. He stopped playing the old games with his neighbors, stopped ribbing men in bars about things that were only jokes to him before. And yet at times Diana would reach for him. Her touch had not been erased by what she had done. When she held him, the old sweetness came back, a taste of honey under the tongue. But now it was almost always followed by a faint, skittering chill, the memory of a scale passing. He loved her in that way people love things that both break and heal them. He forgave her small and large transgressions. He forgave for the solace in her arms. That flaring tension, mercy balanced against law, never went away. It became a constant. At night, Jordan would dream of the cobra's hood rising like a curtain, and then of the mother at the tree, and sometimes of specters that felt like rates on an invisible account. He woke with the taste of